Human spaceflight has allowed us to achieve some of the most impressive feats of the U.S. space program, such as walking on the surface of the moon or repairing the Hubble telescope from space. Over 500 people have flown in space, and at all times, we have 6 people living on the International Space Station, or ISS, orbiting 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. But living and working in the environment of space isn't always easy and can cause significant changes to the human body that can affect the health and well-being of our astronauts. My name is Allie Anderson, and I'm an assistant professor of aerospace engineering at CU Boulder. My research investigates how the human body adapts to space, focusing specifically on vision, mental health, and spacesuit design. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how space affects the human body and how we seek to mitigate these effects. There are several aspects of spaceflight that make it too hostile to support life. One challenge is that outside the protection of the spacecraft, there's a vacuum, which means that there's no air for breathing or to provide pressure against the body. Next, without an atmosphere, space is subject to huge changes in temperature. The temperature in microgravity can swing from about -120 to 110 degrees Celsius. And then there are micrometeorites, or orbital debris. They travel at very high speeds and can cause serious damage if there's an impact. But we're here today to focus on the ways that space affects the human body. So for this discussion, we'll focus on the 3 most important elements of spaceflight that can potentially risk human health. One is a reduction in the amount of gravity acting on the body. 2 is radiation, which can damage or kill cells. And 3, psychological stressors that can result from living in an isolated and confined environment. We'll also look at how these factors affect the body and explain what we as scientists, doctors, psychologists, designers, and engineers can all do to prevent these changes. So let's start with gravity, or rather the lack of its force acting while on orbit. Some of the most profound changes to human health in space are caused by changes in gravitational force acting on the body. When someone is orbiting the Earth, we often say that they're in microgravity. This term often gets confused with the idea that there's no gravity acting on the body, but that's not the case at all. You can never escape the force of gravity because all mass is constantly pulling on all other mass. Instead, being in microgravity is being in a constant state of free fall. It's like when you drop something off the top of a very tall building. Before you drop the ball, while it's in your hand, the ball's mass is being pulled by gravity, giving it a weight. Your hand, though, is counteracting that force while you hold it, so you can feel the weight of the ball. When you drop it, there's nothing preventing it from accelerating to the Earth. So that weight is no longer being felt. Gravity is still causing it to fall, but it's considered weightless. This is why astronauts are considered weightless. But how are they falling? Think of it this way. Take that same ball and throw it off the top of that tall building. It travels forward in the direction that you threw it, but eventually it falls back to the surface of the Earth. If you throw it a little faster, the ball goes a little further, but it will eventually reach the ground. Now imagine that the ball is traveling very fast. As you throw it, it's falling towards the Earth, but imagine if it flew halfway around the Earth before it reaches the surface. As it's flying, the Earth's surface starts to curve away from the ball, allowing it to go even further. Okay, now imagine that you take that same ball and you put it on a rocket. That rocket will make the ball go so fast that this time, as it's falling, the Earth really curves away from it. It's never actually able to reach the ground because the speed is so great. The ball is in a constant state of free fall, but it's called being in orbit since it never reaches the surface. Well, this is exactly what's happening to our astronauts and satellites. They're going so fast that although they're falling towards the surface of the Earth, they never reach the surface. Being in a constant state of free fall is why they can't feel the gravitational force acting on the body. Hence, we call it microgravity. Gravity is extremely important to the way that the body functions. Every time you take a step or create an impact on the bones, these impacts lead to microfractures. And believe it or not, that damage is actually good for the bones. Without gravity or loading on the bones, your body senses that the bone is overbuilt, and your body actually starts to break the bones down. Evidence of this breakdown process can be found through the thinning of the bone, both in the hard outer shell called cortical bone, but also in the inner spongy part of the bone called the trabecula. This thinning and breaking down of bone is the same kind of process that happens in osteoporosis, but it happens at a much faster rate in space. These changes are even worse for the weight-bearing parts of your body, for example, in the lower body. A similar process also happens with your muscles. When your muscles are no longer acting against gravity, either to help you maintain your posture or even to move your limbs against the force of gravity, they also are being sensed as overbuilt for that environment. It's the same process we see when you have a cast on your limb for an extended period of time and don't use your muscles. The muscle starts to atrophy. In space, we see about a 40% reduction in strength over 6 months. That atrophy is particularly bad, again, in the postural muscles, such as in your calves or in your lower back, since they're no longer using them to stand upright against gravity. This loss of strength is caused by muscle fiber types switching from type 1, which is a slow twitch muscle that is able to metabolize more energy, over to type 2 muscles, which are called fast twitch muscles, and they're used for more rapid movements, but are also easier to fatigue. Another adaptation caused by altering the gravity environment is a change to the vestibular system, or the balance organs in your inner ear. When these organs no longer sense the force of gravity, astronauts can actually become sick, similar to what we see with motion sickness. These effects can set in within a few hours of entering orbit. It can also cause problems on shorter timescales. For example, after landing on the surface of the Moon or Mars, where astronauts could have difficulty with balance and locomotion in the new gravity environment. In addition to changes in your bones, muscles, and vestibular system caused by offloading, another important aspect of how changing gravity acts on the body is the removal of something called a hydrostatic gradient. Hydrostatic gradients are found in fluids, where the height of the fluid causes a change in the pressure, just like there's more pressure at the deep end of the swimming pool than in the shallow end. The same is true in your body. Removing that pressure gradient causes fluids to shift upward in the body. This shift in fluid leads to a syndrome called puffy face bird leg, where astronauts' facial tissues actually expand in thickness because of the fluid that's accumulating, while the legs actually look scrawnier because they aren't holding as much fluid. The pressure on your blood in your cardiovascular system starts to equalize from head to toe, and your body thinks that it has too much fluid, so it offloads it, reducing the total amount of fluid in your body. We also see changes in how the heart operates. Because the heart is no longer pumping against gravity, it also starts to atrophy, and we get cardiovascular deconditioning. As a result, astronauts have reduced red blood cell count and also have reduced plasma in their blood, which causes some astronauts to faint once they return to Earth. To prevent fainting, astronauts fluid load by drinking electrolytes before landing to increase their fluid volume. Lastly, removing gravity also removes tissue weight. We're seeing now that astronauts are coming back from long-duration spaceflight with degraded vision and structural damage to the eyes, making them farsighted. We don't really know why this occurs, but changes in hydrostatic gradients, fluid shifts, and tissue weight could all possibly play a role. There's also secondary effects caused by changes in gravity that are detrimental to the human body. For example, astronauts are at an increased risk for kidney stones due to the elevated calcium levels in their body due to the breakdown of bones that I described before. Many of these changes are caused by the astronauts' bodies trying to adapt to the environment, not necessarily because there's some inherent damage caused to the body by being in reduced gravity. Your body is sensing as it's supposed to and adjusting just like it was designed to do. It's a very adaptive system. The problem is that once astronauts return to Earth, they're no longer adapted to our 1G environment, and this causes problems with human health. This adaptation that happens to the body in reduced gravity environments is called physiological deconditioning. The good news is that we hope to send humans to the surface of another planetary body, such as the Moon or Mars, and that gravity on that body may mitigate the physiological deconditioning that the astronauts experience. The bad news is that we don't really know to what extent this deconditioning will be prevented. Is 1/6 or 3/8 of a G enough to prevent the human body from changing? We don't really know. We employ a number of strategies to prevent physiological deconditioning called countermeasures. The best countermeasures we've found against changes in health due to changing gravity loading are exercise and inducing loading on the body. On the ISS, there's a machine called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or the ARED. It uses vacuum tubes to create resistance since lifting weights is not really possible in space. Well, it's possible, but it won't do you any good. The ARED has been very effective in preventing bone and muscle loss in space. The only problem is that the ARED is a really heavy and large device, making it difficult to send to Mars. Exercise physiologists and countermeasure designers at NASA are working, though, to make a similar device that's more compact and lightweight. Maybe you have some ideas about how we can create an even better solution. Another exercise system found on the ISS is a treadmill called the Combined Operational Load-Bearing External Resistive Treadmill, or the Colbert. This treadmill is actually named for Comedy Central comedian Stephen Colbert, who is a space enthusiast and encouraged all of his viewers to vote for the name. NASA went with it, and so this treadmill is now used on the ISS to create loading up to 1 G on the astronaut's body with bungee cords. Then astronauts can run in place on the ISS just like they would here on Earth on a treadmill. This also helps the astronauts' cardiovascular systems. All of the negative changes to the body caused by reduced gravity could also be solved with one comprehensive countermeasure called artificial gravity, or AG. In AG, the person or spacecraft is spun to create a centripetal force. Rotating creates loading along the vertical axis of the body, and although not gravitational force, this rotating can mimic the loading that gravity would cause otherwise. This idea has never actually been implemented in space, but there are a lot of concepts of how you might do this with a long radius centrifuge, which is when a very large spacecraft spins, or with a short radius centrifuge, where only the person is spun inside of a spacecraft module. Here at CU, we actually have our own short radius centrifuge, which we're currently using to do experiments on the eye in different artificial gravity loading conditions. But perhaps what NASA considers the biggest showstopper in terms of human health for a trip to Mars is radiation. Radiation is elevated in space compared to living here on Earth's surface. For our astronauts, there are two major sources of radiation: our own sun and particles coming from outside our solar system. The sun is a constant source of radiation. Most radiation coming from the sun takes the form of electromagnetic radiation, for example, X-rays or ultraviolet radiation. This radiation is typically not ionizing, meaning it does not typically cause changes in the charges of atoms, which can then ultimately damage our DNA. The sun also emits particles such as protons or electrons that have high energy and are capable of doing damage to our cells. Protons and electrons can also get trapped in the Earth's magnetic field in the Van Allen radiation belts, exacerbating the amount of damage that they're capable of doing because it's a more concentrated dose. Therefore, astronauts passing through the Van Allen belts on their way to the Moon or Mars could be temporarily exposed to elevated proton and electron damage. Solar particle events also pose an acute threat. When the sun emits massive amounts of these particles, sending them our way with very little warning. Then we also have particles coming from outside the solar system called galactic cosmic radiation. These particles vary in mass and velocity and include the nuclei of atoms created in faraway stars, ranging from as small as hydrogen to as large as iron. The average speed of these particles is 95% of the speed of light. So with their higher mass, they have the potential to do a great deal of damage to our cells. The good news is that when the sun is at its solar maximum, it helps prevent galactic cosmic radiation from entering the solar system. The bad news, though, is that the solar radiation is increased at that time, and vice versa for solar minimum. So there's really a trade-off between which type of radiation astronauts will be exposed to most, depending upon when we launch them in the sun's solar cycle. There's one more kind of radiation that we have to be concerned about, called secondary radiation. Secondary radiation can occur when high-energy massive particles strike the material in the spacecraft, causing them to ionize. This creates a cascade of secondary radiation that can also damage the body. On Earth, we have an atmosphere and magnetic field to protect us. On the ISS, there's no atmosphere to speak of outside the spacecraft, but we're still relatively protected by the Earth's magnetic field. On the Moon, we don't have an atmosphere nor a magnetic field, but for part of the orbit, the Earth can sort of block some of that radiation that'd be coming from the Sun. Mars has about 1% of the Earth's atmosphere, so it doesn't really provide much protection. Nor does Mars have a magnetic field, so it's also not being shielded from the radiation coming from the Sun. So Mars could potentially be a really bad radiation environment for our future astronauts. Sensors on our Mars rovers, though, indicate that maybe the radiation in transit and on the surface isn't as bad as it could be. But the radiation environment is constantly changing, so it's currently really difficult to estimate the real risk due to radiation for a human taking a trip to Mars. When radiation hits your body, it can A, hit water molecules causing free radicals, which will then do damage to your DNA, or B, hit DNA directly, causing either a single or double strand break, depending upon the size and energy of the particle. Your body may be able to repair itself from this damage, but the damage is cumulative over time, so it may be hard for your body to continue to repair itself. Alternatively, the cells might detect that the damage is too great and it should kill itself. This may happen after a solar particle event, where we see acute radiation syndrome. Many cells detect that they've been damaged and begin to shut down. Alternatively, the damage to DNA could turn into mutation, which is then propagated and continues to produce damaged cells. This is how cancer can begin, which is a really scary risk for our astronauts. So how do we protect astronauts from radiation? The #1 countermeasure we use against radiation is shielding, usually in the form of passive shielding from spacecraft walls. The sleeping quarters on the ISS have styrofoam blocks that are low in mass and relatively effective at absorbing radiation. Astronauts can also help prevent radiation damage by eating foods that are high in antioxidants or wearing topical skin protection. Unfortunately, these measures don't protect against much of the damage coming from galactic cosmic radiation. Others have proposed using active shielding by generating very large electric or magnetic fields around the spacecraft. So far, though, the engineering challenges with these ideas have been too great to actually be implemented. Because there's no magnetic field or thick atmosphere on the Moon or Mars, some have proposed using soil found naturally on these bodies as a way to provide radiation protection. Imagine a storm shelter with soil piled on top of the habitat for added protection. In addition to all the physical effects of living in space, it's also important to discuss the psychological challenges of living and working as an astronaut. The International Space Station is a relatively large spacecraft with a large volume. The inside of the ISS is as large as a 747 airplane, but much of that space is taken up by cargo and storage and science experiments and all the other things that astronauts need to live and work in space. On the ISS, operational pressures are incredibly high and the environment is also dangerous, which can add to elevated levels of stress for astronauts. Sleep issues on orbit can also lead to increased risk of depression and stress. Another cause of stress is that these individuals live and work with the same people for around 6 months. So any conflict that might arise is hard to escape, and those issues can start to build and compound. Access to family and friends is also more limited than here on Earth, and this is particularly hard if something goes wrong with a loved one. Imagine how much worse that would be when you're on a trip to Mars and the communication delay could be up to 20 minutes each way. For the most part, astronauts are really resilient to most of these behavioral health issues, but there have been some incidences in space caused by traumatic events or conflict with the personnel in mission control. Another potential risk of sending humans to somewhere as far away as Mars is that we don't know how people will react to being so far away from the Earth. On the ISS, we know that one of their favorite pastimes is to look out of the window at our beautiful Earth. Could a human being experience a profound shift in perspective by seeing the Earth as no different than just another bright star in the sky? Well, this is exactly what happened to many Apollo astronauts who found their trip to the moon and seeing the Earth from so far away as a profoundly life-changing experience, in a positive way. But it still remains as an unknown as to how this could affect any given individual. We have a lot to learn about the psychological challenges of living in space and how to mitigate these effects on our astronauts. To improve understanding of the complexities of team dynamics and effective tools to reduce conflict, it's important to develop resources that will ensure that the crew can get along and be successful. Increased opportunities for private communication with doctors and family and friends is also important. Computer-based resources are a great option to provide privacy and also to open communication. Reducing the stigma related to mental health issues is also very important so that individuals will seek out help when they need it without fear of affecting their job or performance. Minimizing operational pressures and facilitating crew autonomy is also really important because it reduces external stressors and allows astronauts the ability to be more flexible with their schedule. More research and scheduling tools is an ongoing and large question that could improve the aspect of astronauts' work life to reduce stress. So while it's clear that there are many different ways that the human body adapts to microgravity, we've done a pretty good job at mitigating the physiological deconditioning with our accumulated knowledge over the history of all of human spaceflight. An area of focus for future scientists or researchers, such as yourselves, might be to improve the methods and the tools that we use to mitigate the physiological effects of living and working in space. Our goal is always to minimize the risks to human health in order to allow the astronauts to focus on science and exploration rather than their health. We are on the verge of achieving amazing things by exploring the moon or Mars, things that could unlock the history of our solar system or maybe even tell us how life formed here on Earth. By designing countermeasures to protect our astronauts and investigating how the body responds to space, my hope is that we can help them stay in space for longer durations, increasing the amount of science and exploration humankind is capable of achieving. I look forward to seeing what solutions your generation comes up with next. Thank you.